This is the Exploring Astrology podcast, and I'm your host, Adam Summer.
It's time for a news story. I suggest that the stories we need turned up right on time about 5,000 years ago. We need a news story. We didn't just dream our carefully individuated thoughts. We got dreamt.
Alexa, what is love?
Love is everywhere, but mainly it's in you. Love is something that can be found in Paul McCartney, in a rose, in a cloud, in any planet that you point your eyes to. Love is basically the dance between Venus and Mars.
Sitting in the stand of the sports arena, waiting for the show to begin. Red lights, green lights, strawberry wine. A good friend of mine follows the stars. Venus and Mars are alright tonight.
You can learn about love by tracking the sacred dance of Venus and Mars. Is there anything else I can help you with?
Oh, Alexa, I'm sure there's so much you could help me with as far as understanding the Venus and Mars conjunctions, because in all the years that I've been studying astrology, this conjunction is probably, next to eclipses, the most elusive and hard to interpret aspect in astrology. It is not predictable. It shows up in so many different ways in people's natal charts, their nativities, and in a mundane sense, it's all over the place. But what I'm going to do is share what I have discovered along the road, especially concentrated in this last month with you today. That's part of the podcast, and trying to understand, what is the rhythm? What is the timing? Is there a lifespan to these conjunctions? How are they different? I think I might be on to, well, something. But what I also want to do is kind of calculate and modify the microscope a little bit on the conjunction that's about to happen on October 5th or October 6th, depending on where you're living on the planet. And so I'm recording this on September 23rd, 2017, and Mercury just reached 19 degrees of Virgo. That is the degree that Mars and Venus are going to come together. And so we're also going to focus on that a little bit. That degree, that space in the zodiac, also because the conjunction happens in the morning sky, what does that mean? How is it connected to something else that might travel back all the way to the 17th century? Something like this. And I think that in my exploration and in my questionings around this, that you too hopefully will be able to help in this exploratory journey, but also learn something along the way. And so I didn't want to talk about the news today, and so I actually employed Venus and Mars to do it instead.
So, you want to read?
Go for it, babe.
Alright. So the main way that you can support Adam's podcast is through patreon.com/exploringastrology. And when you go to the site, you will see all of these different tier levels that you can choose for how you want to support the podcast every month. There's a new one that he made me remember, which is $100 a month. And you get all the gifts, plus a monthly tutoring session with him.
No way.
Yeah, way. And so you just go to Patreon /exploringastrology and you can find that. Also, if you go to iTunes and leave a star or a review, you will automatically be submitted to the Lunar Raffle.
What's that?
Well, it allows you to basically win a free reading if you have luck, lady luck, on your side. So do those things if you enjoy this podcast. And also, what are you doing?
What are you talking about?
Well, you're not looking at me. You're not paying attention to me.
Oh, well, I thought you said you wanted to read the news, so I was just playing with solar fire here.
Solar Fire. Thanks for reminding me. So, also, if you use promo code SOMA when you are purchasing Solar Fire, you get 15% off of the program. And Adam is also throwing in the class that he did on Sunday when you show proof of purchase of Solar Fire.
No way.
Again, way. And finally, we just recently went on these journeys. Venus, went on a Venus journey, and
Mars, went on the Mars journey.
with Adam, and it was amazing. We both learned so much, and we, I think, have a completely different understanding of ourselves at this point.
Oh, for sure.
So you can use this promo code Venus Mars in his store at holstoheavens.com, and you will get 32% off the Venus or the Mars journeys. Actually, it applies to everything in his store, but I highly recommend those two readings.
I definitely do too. They really did help a lot.
And so that's it. That's the news, my friends, and I hope it wasn't too painful.
Who said it was too painful?
I don't think anybody did.
Good.
You're so intense sometimes.
Love is a canvas furnished by nature and embroidered by imagination. Voltaire said that. And in the English language, we have a single word for love. Love. Sanskrit alone is said to have nearly 100 for its various manifestations. Even in ancient Greece, there is at least a half dozen, pointing out the subtle, yet not so subtle expressions of what keeps us here. Love is elusive. And it keeps our tongue tied, our palms sweaty, our eyes searching for the scene. Then can make our hearts feel broken, influencing nearly every move we make. It is indeed furnished by nature, the unruly and electric nature of Venus and Mars. So, soon, the two of them will caress in the morning sky. When they come together, the specific meaning is elusive, no different from love. At times, there can be 3 make-out sessions a year, thanks to Venus going retrograde. At other times, around every 2 years. Sometimes it's in the morning sky, other times it's in the evening sky, then sometimes we can't see them at all. Just like Eros to Psyche. This has puzzled me since the beginning of my studies in astrology. I knew there was a rhythm, some kind of harmony, but I couldn't find it. Their conjunctions in the natal chart are just as slippery. At times, they manifest as overly sexed individuals who don't know how to be alone, and others, those that are afraid of commitment. In the sky, when these conjunctions happen, the elusiveness continues still, or at least it did. I think I might be onto something, like I said before. And so let's get first acquainted with the both of them. If you hear raindrops above my head, it's because it's, raining outside, and I can't quite fix that. But I think it adds to the romance of talking about Venus and Mars, perhaps. And so let's first start with getting acquainted with Venus. Naked as she came, floating to the shores of Cyprus, her island, the home of her metal, copper, found in all of us, but more so in women. Its ebb and flow can be tracked with ovulation and in the function of the pill. a soft and conductive metal, not unlike the goddess adorned in its glorious forms from azurite to turquoise. Stare into the eye of a peacock feather and you are transported into the heart of Venus. Her halls are filled with copper. Listen closely to the horn section and be taken by her. Drift off into the blue-green abyss and find creatures of the sea breathing by means of copper, not iron, like us terrestrial creatures. She is the morning and the evening star rising and falling perennially in all of us. 5 points to her star. She is the artist of everything beautiful. So, currently, like a fox on ice, she steps around the great American eclipse degree, which is 28, Leo. She's moved on to Virgo at this point, but still quite close, especially if you're looking at the sky and actually engaging with her. Readying herself for her tenure in Virgo. And it's somewhere in this maze of tropical Virgo where the bell tolls and her heart blossoms with the roses gifted years ago from Mars. And we'll get to that after we get to know him a little bit better. And so we turn to Mars. Always found near the heat, whether it be the forge, the battlefield, or the alchemist's laboratory, you will find him there, always with his metal, iron. Abundant here, the core of this earth, it shows our true north. She is our true north. And if it is copper that dominates in women, then it must be iron in men. Iron-willed, he journeys from sky to sky, from this side of the sun to the other, much further than she can go, in search for his partner, securing what she needs, or is it the other way around? Essential to healthy blood, with too little, we become anemic and weak of will. That is, short of iron. It is the combustion of cell and engine, containing the explosiveness of nature, allowing us to move forward. In both sword and shield, he defends and protects what we love and value in this life. He is the trusted hand of the goddess. Currently, Mars is fresh and ready for action. Having just emerged in the morning sky, he's readying himself for the big day. It's a personal feeling, one that points in a different direction for all of us, but essentially relates to the power to make the change happen once and for all. A sense of finally being ready to be seen. Already in Virgo, well, they're both in Virgo now, he is securing the trail which leads directly into his arms at 19 degrees of Virgo on October 5th/6th of 2015. So now to address one of the big problems, and which sky do they meet in? Is it the morning sky, the evening sky, or no sky at all? Well, this conjunction happens in the morning sky. In fact, if you travel back 32 years, you will see nearly the same conjunction between them in Virgo, just a few degrees off in 1985. It was also around October 5th. Travel back to 53, to 21, and you will discover the same situation with just a bit of drift going backwards in the zodiac. All these conjunctions occurring in the morning sky. And if you go forward, advancing to 2049, they will be found forest bathing at sunrise once again within the virgin forest, just a few degrees forward. A pattern is emerging. My first clue, which came to me years ago, was through Alexander Ruperti's book, Cycles of Becoming. In it, he points at a few interesting observations between the two of them, but nothing really made my heart bloom. I then came across Robert Blatsky's article in the Mountain Astrology years ago called Aberrations in the Venus-Mars Cycle, and that threw a stick in my spokes because in it, he observes this strange aberration every 200 years or so when there are conjunctions, especially where every fifth conjunction is when Venus is retrograde. Well, it begins to become unpredictable and spread apart for around 100 years. That is, every 200 years. confusing because when I applied some of my very amateur-esque research skills to this, it didn't make any sense. It was not tidy. Sometimes it was 100 to 200. Sometimes it was longer. Sometimes it was shorter. And I kind of gave up on trying to understand it like that. And that aberration started in the early 60s, 59, 60 according to him, and then we'll get to this other woman's research here in a bit and how it starts to make a little bit more sense. But we're at the moment in 2017 in the midst, at the midpoint almost, of the aberration, the strange drift of their conjunctions. And so I always had this feeling that the cosmos are orderly, right? Like the first synodic cycle that I fell in love with was that of Venus, and it's pretty tidy. It's predictable. And then I started studying some other ones, especially Mars, and you're like, oh, you're a little bit different. 15, 17, 15, 17, like all these different ways of it happening, and not as tidy, but most of the cosmos is. And so I knew that there was something to this, and I didn't give up. And so quite recently, a student of mine suggested I read this book by Michelle Feeney. I think that's how I pronounce her last name. She's an Australian astrologer, and she wrote this book called The Sacred Dance of Venus and Mars. In it, I found some essential pieces to this puzzle. So in her book, she seemingly had the same magnet pointed to her head as I did, with the same feelings swimming around in there. What she discovered was a pattern between them. Still not as neat and tidy as the Venus-Sun synodic cycle, but still more than I had ever read or listened or learned about. She calls it the Venus-Mars Saros cycle, similar to how you can study the eclipses, but instead relating it to Venus and Mars. This is beyond the scope of this podcast to go fully into it, but here are a few of the basics, and we'll revisit it in a different part of the podcast as well. 1. The cycle begins with a Venus-Mars conjunction in the morning sky. Always. 2. It can be while Venus is retrograde or direct. 3. The direct ones last much longer, nearly 1,000 years longer. A Saros that started with Venus retrograde on average is 300 years, but it can also be 250 or 350 as far as I understand it. And when the conjunction in the morning sky happens when Venus is direct, that cycle moving forward in the zodiac is 1,200 years. Okay? 4. They slowly move from morning to the evening sky over the time span of the Saros. So that's fascinating. Morning sky, no sky, superior conjunction, evening sky. 5. As with Bernadette Brandy's Saros eclipse work, you study the chart for the first conjunction in the series to understand the succeeding conjunctions every 32 years. All right. Now, that too is still kind of rattling around in my head because it's kind of hard for me when looking back after reading the book, knowing exactly when the precise beginning is. Sometimes to me it looks like it's the one before what Miss Feeney says. Other times it looks like the one that's after it. And so that's something that I'm going to have to talk to her about, and I have invited her on the podcast, and we're going to be able to do that soon. So we'll get there. So for instance, the conjunction coming up on the 5th of October, if we see it this way, originated in 1665, September 7th or 8th to be exact, at 29 degrees of Cancer. And we'll get to that in a bit. We'll try to pick it apart just a bit and try to understand, like, how does the origin chart inform us about the conjunction that's about to happen. But to keep it simple for all of you, my lovely listeners, let's not forget that the conjunction happens in Virgo, an earth sign, one where we can see the undressing of a lot of the discerning tactics of the goddess or the god when it comes down to love. That it's in this space that we will also soon discover that spirit is encapsulated beneath something, beneath matter, beneath stories, beneath layers of a lot of our own constructions, I would say. And so maybe it's through the polarity to Virgo, which is Pisces, where we open up to some sort of an embrace, a new idea, a new way of seeing something like the Venus-Mars conjunction, and kind of beginning to, I guess, explore in more depth how to distill this ever so confusing love affair between the two closest planets to the Earth. It's a study of Jon Snow pulling Khaleesi's hand closer to his after such tragedy. It is Eros cloaking his identity to Psyche. It is Beauty and the Beast, Harmonia and Cadmus, Shiva and Shakti, Yin and Yang. And you want to know what else is interesting is that on October 5th, there's also an Aries full moon. Who are the rulers of the Libra sun and the Aries moon? But Venus and Mars. And this is something that actually Michelle pointed out in a post on Facebook, and I just had missed it because I'd been so focused, I suppose, on this conjunction that I wasn't actually looking at lunations. And I like that. So what we have is this full moon, an Aries full moon, where the rulers of it are actually coming together the same day. The most important thing in life is style, perhaps. That of one's existence, the characteristic mode of our actions, our wild connection to this mystery, not the Venus-Mars mystery specifically, but say the mystery of life, to the unknown, to nature, and to learn style. So important, this style idea from the Golden Mountain Breeze. There's an electricity of the two of them coming together and also falling apart. A dynamo that is created between the copper and the iron of these planetary archetypes. And like I've mentioned, it has been a very confusing study because it does show up so differently in so many different people that, of course, there's a multivalence to how any placement or any aspect is going to show up in everyone's chart, but I'm talking vast difference. The difference between people that are always in a relationship, always having sex, always with their mind on the prize, to the complete opposite of being single for long stretches of time, Saturn cycles even, and both of them having it. Like, to me, that is so confusing when you see a Venus-Mars conjunction, but also the dynamic kind of magnetism that is said in so many astrology books to be present in individuals that have this, and then being around individuals as well that have this aspect, and then, well, they don't have that. They don't have the panache, they don't have the charisma, they don't have the looks, they don't have the lust for life. And then I'm like, well, what the fuck is the deal with this? And so we're going to get deep into this idea right about now. First, let's just talk about it in a mundane sense, because there's all of these really interesting cases that I've always noticed, and also in Michelle's book, The Sacred Dance of Venus and Mars, that she illustrates as well in her method, looking at the origin chart, that original conjunction, and seeing things. And this, too, is a door that just flings open for so much study to be done, because honestly, there's not a lot of information out there on this. I've listed where I've seen it. I've heard a couple other people talk about interesting angles on the Venus-Mars conjunctions and their cycles, but at this point, I open it up to any suggestions, because in the 10 years of me doing this show, I have not found a lot of really deep evidence of what really goes on between the two of them. And so when you look at it in a mundane sense, like that is in a historical way, an event kind of a way, you see strange things, like the assassination of JFK, the birth of Hitler. There's all these correlations that Michelle makes in her book around the United States chart, around 9/11, connecting that, even very recently, the Mexico earthquake, to the day. So in 1985, on September 19th, there was a huge earthquake in Mexico that killed around 5,000 people. Well, the earthquake that just happened was also on September 19th, and it hasn't killed as many people, but still, statistics don't need to compare. They're odious. But like on the same day, at the same part of this Venus-Mars dynamic, this earthquake happens. And so there's a way maybe of studying seismic activity, especially when you look at the chart for Mexico City and the sun lies at 22 degrees Virgo, and the two of them are heading for that degree. The JFK thing is really interesting because, for example, when you look at JFK's chart, he has Venus in Gemini at 16 degrees. And the conjunction that happened the day of his assassination, it was actually the day before the conjunction, but it was Mars was at 20 Sag and Mercury was at 21. So that's an opposition. It's not exact to the degree, but it's enough to look at, in my opinion, especially that it squares his moon in such a way. And then you look at Jackie's chart, right? Who was riding in the back seat with him on that tragic day in Texas. And she too has Venus in Gemini, but even more specifically, it's at 21 degrees of Gemini. Well, that conjunction again happened at 21 degrees of Sag. And so you see these axial alignments that occur in these really big events that, of course, change history forever. And you begin to wonder, like if you're a researcher, if your ears are pricked and your mind is ignited around this idea, then I totally say go for it. You should go down this road and you should do some research. And when you find stuff, you should reach out to me and talk to me about it because it's ever so new to me. But for my purposes, I mainly am creative with astrology with this podcast and my writing, and I teach and I give readings. That's the main thing I do. I'm not much of a researcher. I'm not much of an academic. And so for me, the puzzle has always related to watching this in people's chart. Again, morning sky, evening sky, no sky conjunctions. That is part of me scratching my head. But also the wide spectrum of how the two of them tend to show up in people's lives, around relationships, around their appeal, around their panache, around how they do the whole relational dynamic thing. And when you look at some books in this, like, and I have a great library here that I can leaf through and check out things, you start to just see like, oh, it's magnetic, and it's people with this conjunction get really bored easily. They kind of have the love 'em or leave 'em mentality and all of this. And no, no, it's vague. That's just cookbook astrology can be so frustrating in that way. Like that is so, I think, harmful to people that have that conjunction and they read that and you're like trying to squeeze meaning out of the idea of like, do I love them and then leave them? I'm sure you could find some reason in that, but is that really your MO? Is that your approach? Probably not. It's probably somewhere else. And so I think that maybe looking at a couple examples could be helpful of just people that are also born with these Venus-Mars conjunctions. Some famous folk, where there's a wild kind of electricity is one of my observations that exists in these folks. Hard to paint words over it, but definitely some kind of panache, the word that I'm using here. I like that word. Travis Pastrana was born with the conjunction in Virgo in the morning sky, and he's that crazy extreme sports guy that has, what is it called, Pastranaland or the Nitro Circus, that's what it is, out east, and motocross stuff, BMX stuff, just insane. His connection, and this is a really easy way of understanding it through the idea of Venus. She's the one that connects to, oh, I love that. I value that. I want that. And then the Mars thing is, well, all right. I will go get that for you. I have the adrenaline. I have the willpower. I have the know-how. I will do that. And so you see it in someone that will do a triple backflip on a motocross bike or something like this, facing fear. You have people like Dominic Cruz, who is a UFC fighter that has it in Aries. And it's a similar feeling, I think, like the connection to like, all I know is fighting. This is all I've ever loved and all I ever want. And so Mars is like, all right, let's do this. Let's fight. You see it in a lot of comedians. Hannibal Buress has it in Pisces. Richard Pryor has it in Scorpio. Jim Carrey has it in Taurus. Bill Burr has it in Gemini. And I think that with that way of thinking about it, because I've always related comedy to the archetype of Scorpio, Pluto in the 8th house, but Mars is the traditional ruler of Scorpio. And so when the two of them together, you have this wild kind of dynamism, that's the right word to use, where they can create like a universal compatibility to what might be funny to an audience. I myself can't think of anything scarier than standing with a microphone in front of 1,000 people and trying to make them laugh. That would be super tough. People born with it, like Hitler, exact conjunction in Taurus in his 7th house. Bill Clinton. So the connection, the love to power, and the means of knowing how to get it. Can't judge the value systems of any man or woman. Gandhi had it in Scorpio in the evening sky. Bruce Lee as well, Scorpio, the connections to peace or making peace, harmony, and justice. Some of my favorite ladies from Hollywood or the silver screen, like Uma Thurman, that has it. Liv Tyler in Taurus in the morning sky. Sandra Bullock has it in Cancer. Like all three of those women have been like crushes of mine throughout my life on the silver screen, especially when I was a kid, when it comes down to Liv Tyler. And then you have Chris Cornell, which for you ladies, I'm sure is also true. His conjunction's in Gemini. He's no longer with us, unfortunately, and there's conspiracies that surround it, but his connection, of course, is to the voice and to music, being the frontman of Soundgarden, Gemini, relating to that. Another person who has it in Gemini is one of my favorite podcasters, Tim Ferriss. And his whole gig is sharing information for self-improvement. Gemini means... right? I've also been listening to this hardcore history with Dan Carlin on the wrath of the Khans. I've been meaning to listen to it probably for 5 years or however long it's been out. And Genghis Khan, like I know this isn't his accurate birth time, but still roughly around the time, September 14th, 1186. And you see that there's quite a situation in his chart where it's Jupiter, conjunct Venus, conjunct Saturn, conjunct Mars, conjunct Mercury, conjunct the South Node, all in Libra. And part of what Dan in this 4-part series illustrates is just the genius, the social genius, the way in which he can employ his enemies or those defeated that are really good at things, but also really connected in other politics and other cultures and other languages and other ways of seeing the world. And that's a Libra concept, if you ask me. So Timochin is his name, one of the greatest conquerors of all time, not to esteem him at all because of the millions and millions of lives that he did take. But what we're looking at is just the conjunctions and natal charts, these wild connections, ones that I think when you make lists, like for example, when you employ Solar Fire and you run a search for Venus-Mars conjunctions of all the charts that you have, you begin to notice patterns. And what would that pattern be with all the people that I just listed? And also I don't list clients, I don't list friends just out of privacy, but something that seems to be really apparent is this idea of very dynamic energy and also knowing what one wants out of life. And so that, of course, doesn't always relate to romantic connections, right? It can relate to taking over the world. It can relate to being a champion in the octagon. It can relate to making people laugh. Like all of these folks might not be chivalrous, romantic types, right? But that connection between Venus and Mars and their chart creates this very electric, very wild energy that we can say maybe completely rules their lives.
Only that breath breathing human being.
What I want to do now is take a deeper look into their cycle. This peacock dance that we're going to all experience on October 5th. So when viewed from the Earth, the conjunctions of Venus and Mars can happen a few weeks apart, a few months apart, or up to 23 months apart. It all depends if Venus is retrograde. All right. Now, they also tend to skip back and forth across the zodiac randomly. Each conjunction is a part of a series of conjunctions that step along the zodiac in a predictable way every 32 years or so. So when Venus and Mars renew their vows every 32 years, their meeting point moves a few degrees along the zodiac. Under the 32 years have passed, the point of the conjunction will have shifted along again by a few degrees, and so on. Some of these conjunction cycles advance through the zodiac in direct motion, some of them move backwards. All right, and so this also comes from Michel Feeney's work, where it was just kind of amazing to see that someone did research that kind of brought some order to these conjunctions for me, because even with Rudyard and Ruperti's work, like, it was not that orderly in the observation of at least what I've read or what I've listened to from the two of them, that if the original conjunction is direct, it moves forward in the zodiac every 32 years for 1200. If it's retrograde, the first conjunction, it moves backwards in the zodiac every 32 years for around 250 or 300 years. I know it's confusing, but that is the basic idea. Okay? And it's something where, I mean, I point you to her book, The Sacred Dance of Venus and Mars, but also you can play around with this pretty easily in SolarFire or any other program that allows you to manipulate time and do searches like this, to where you can begin to come up with your own philosophy. So, for example, for years, ever since reading Robert Blatchke's article on the aberrations of the Venus-Mars cycle, he noticed that predictable fifth conjunction where Venus is always retrograde began to split in the early 60s and did so for nearly 100 years, basically until 2060. All right, and I thought that was really interesting, because or kind of his as well, but what my interpretation of that was every time that happens, every 200 years or so, which actually, according to Michelle, is the beginning. It's when actually endings and beginnings of these longer Saros, Venus-Mars cycles are starting. And so it kind of breaks up, and it seems that it is disorderly, but maybe it's not. But it's from the 60s until 2060 that in my own mind, I'm like, oh, like, this is a no man's land. This is where relationships begin to experiment, that our ways of relating to sex, that is of body, but also in the shared experience of relational dynamics, all of these themes begin to mutate during these periods. And so we look back to the 60s, and it's kind of obvious, right? That, oh, there is a lot of wild connections around that. Like, for example, I think it was 59 or 60 that it was the year that the pill was introduced. That the pill is something that tricks the woman's body, as far as I understand it, that it's an ovulation. And so it's actually, when you think about Venus, creating large amounts of copper in the body so that pregnancy cannot occur. My very basic understanding of this, but there's also different technologies that employ copper that also repel sperm and the potential of pregnancy to occur. But also we look back to then, and there was such an amazing influence from other cultures. It was very dynamic. It was very wild, right? Where, sure, sex and relationships and all of this were under question. But then there was also an influence, a diaspora almost, of ideas all over the world that were coming together in the West, where we had Tantra and Egyptian mystery schools and Buddhist celibacy that were kind of infiltrating the minds of so many people. We had the emergence of nature through Venus, like good marijuana and the remembering of the sacraments and things like this that started to occur, an opening of the body, seeing the body as nature, yoga then, meditation, massage, sexual healing, divorces beginning to skyrocket and become a norm, gender inquiries, confusions around that, the freedom to explore and do our best to rewire the programming on external beauty, like Beauty and the Beast, for example, which is one of the great stories, I think, around Venus and Mars. It's a fascinating study, and I think that looking back in time to every single time that it begins to split up and it turns into this territory of relational or Venus and Mars exploration, like you can probably notice that. I'm not a historian and I don't have all the time in the world to do that kind of study, but like if that's what you're into, looking into this could be an amazing topic of research. I just got tongue-tied, and that's totally okay. So the sadness of connection, I think that's something that plagues a lot of people in the world because of the experimentation and because of what, happens during these phases. That once upon a time in America alone, marriage was the norm for adults. But now, for the first time since the Bureau of Labor Statistics began tracking these numbers since '76, there are more single Americans than people that are married. Over 50% of people in this country are single. That's over 124 million American adults single. It's no wonder why so many people are using Tinder and Bumble and OkCupid and just sad because they don't have this connection. Things are changing. And there's a depth to this that I think that I'm going to hopefully lead us into a perfection maybe of this. But it's a scary thing that like also first marriages have a 40% success rate, that second marriages have a 60%, or no, opposite, 60% for failure, and third marriages, a 73% chance of failure. And when does that all happen? The average age of the first divorce in people in the West, 30 years of age. That is the end of the Saturn return. That's 100 divorces per hour if you do the stats. And to me, that's not the saddest thing in the world. I think it's people becoming clear about their values, what they need in their lives, and going after that. I think it's a really beautiful thing, to be completely honest. Not that I've ever been through a technical divorce, but I've been through a few divorces or just breakups that feel like divorces in my life. And I think it's a beautiful thing in retrospect because people grow, people evolve. We have the freedom to do that. And I'm so happy that we have the freedom to divorce and we don't become exiled or executed because of that. But it also creates the sadness of connecting to the idea of love. Like the pornography industry, for example, or I was just watching Vice the other day and they were doing a piece on child porn. That there's over $34 million a year that goes into the child porn industry. Most of these consumers of it are here in the States, and it happens online with like children in Thailand and stuff like this. It's the most hideous thing in the world, but like what creates it is my inquiry, the why, like what creates this. And I think it's a lack of connection to what is most important in life, and that isn't necessarily a partner. It's something different. It's something that goes into the body. It's something that drives into the heart. It trickles down into the soul. It ignites the spirit. It helps us to remember. We have the freedom to do these explorations at this point. And I think that when there's this interesting book, I'm sure a lot of you have seen it, but this is where some of my ideas go with it. And it's called A Little Book of Coincidences in the Solar System. It's by John Martineau. I think that's how I pronounce his name. And he basically shows these spiral patterns between planets, synodic cycles, but also planets and planets, and how they create these patterns in the solar system. And what is really fascinating is that the Venus and Mars pattern is pretty much identical to the Uranus and Pluto pattern. Now, why is this interesting? First of all, the pattern, you can look it up probably on Google really quickly, is it looks that if you were to connect the circles between the two of them, that it is essentially a Vesica Pisces. All right, that's the pattern between the Venus-Mars cycle and the Uranus-Pluto one as well. And what we first have to do is relate the two. That we know that the Uranus-Pluto cycle is one that also began in the 60s, just like this aberration began. And it is usually what is pointed to when relating all of the revolution, all of the human freedoms, all of the discovery, all of the human rights, all of the psychedelics, all the good music, all of that kind of stuff, because the Pluto-Uranus combination is kind of like flinging open Pandora's box. But why not think about Venus and Mars like that as well, especially if there is important cycles that are ending and beginning around that time? The second thing we need to do is related to the Vesica Pisces, which is basically the shape where you have two circles intersecting and they touch the midpoint of both of the circles. And the Vesica Pisces is basically the essence of what then creates the flower of life. The flower of life is 19, which is also the degree of this conjunction. Not that I need to distill too many synchronicities out of this, but 19 intersecting circles within the boundary of a larger circle, and it is said that all patterns can be found within it. But the Vesica Pisces also is the seed for life, that Mars and Venus also seeds for life, like our blood, our very being, the attraction that we feel to everything and our capacity to go and get it. All dynamic energy, all attraction, all love in this dimension relates to Venus and Mars. And then you also see this pattern, the Vesica Pisces, and how it then blossoms into the flower of life and its relationship to also maybe the Uranus and Pluto situation. I think that too is absolutely fascinating. Especially when we look back and we entertain this idea, like Brady does with the eclipses, like what was the origin of the Saros cycle for an eclipse? Well, you can do the same thing with the Venus and Mars. And supposedly the first conjunction for this one that's happening on the 5th that occurred was direct, and it was in 1665. That conjunction happened in the morning sky, just like this one. They've all been in the morning sky every single 32 years. Since 1665, and it happened at 29 degrees of Cancer. All right. Now, I don't know too terribly much about what relationships were like East and West in the late 17th century. Did a little bit of research on it. I found some fun things, like this blasphemous book called The School of Venus, where there's these women lined up with penises on a hook, and they're like observing them, and in it, it's kind of like an erotic manual, French, actually, teaching people how to basically have sex. It's like a tantric manual, and it was burned, of course, and I think the author as well. I don't know that for sure, but an area of research, right? To go back to then and be like, oh, so like if this cycle started then, like what was the relational themes then, and how does it relate to now as far as an evolution is concerned? Well, one way that we can look at it is by looking at the Sabian symbol for 29 degrees of Cancer, or rounding up to 30, which is a daughter of the American Revolution. What starts a revolution, except for repression of Mars and Venus, that is controlling people's desires, whatever people feel connected to, trying to get in between that and taxing that or blocking that, fucking with freedoms. What we are free to do, we are human beings and we should have those liberties. And this country here was supposedly founded on it. And, well, how much has that changed? How much has it evolved and how much has it devolved is my point. And so like we have these dreams that we see in the origin of this chart. By the way, if you want to cast it for yourself, it's September 7th or 8th of 1665, and you'll see 29 degrees of Cancer as the conjunction between the two of them. But these dreams of revolution from the colonies way back then, trying to be free from the crown, all the way to the present in 2017, when you have people coming together and connecting under values that just might be the future, like in Black Rock Desert. We have come a long ways, but we still have a long ways to go. There's still nearly 1,000 years left in this cycle. They're still in the morning sky. These conjunctions haven't disappeared yet. They haven't emerged in the evening sky yet. There's still some time to go around this. And so one thing that I think is valuable that you can do is you can go back to the last conjunction in this series, 32 years ago, to October of 1985. Now, I was only 2 years old then. I had scarlet fever that year. I almost died. And I also was almost taken out by a hurricane, as far as my mom just told me recently, because she's down in Florida and she just experienced that hurricane. And she was telling me this story. And so I don't know how much that relates, aside from the fact that both of these conjunctions do occur in my first house, and body issues are what are on my mind at the moment, in a really good way. It's not that I have scarlet fever at the moment. It sure doesn't sound like it or feel like it. But like, you look back to 1665, and we'll just kind of look here to where most of my listeners do live in North America. And this is also when the Navigation Act was trying to be employed from England. And it basically said that only English imports could come into the American colonies. And so, of course, there was rebellion around this. Of course, there was resistance. Of course, it didn't go over that well. And it was 100 years before the American Revolution. But still, there's something to be studied, I think, within that as well. And so finally, that brings us, as we turn the microscope a little bit, into this specific conjunction. We've understood a little bit of the history. We've looked at some of the philosophy and the theory around this, what it might be like in a person's natal chart, stuff like that. And now we look at the one that's going to happen on October 5th. It happens at 19 degrees of Virgo. Also the second decan of Virgo, the last degrees of it. This is a space where I think taking off the layers and the masks is a requirement. That when you read Austin Coppock's 36 Faces book on this decan, he calls it the hammer and the anvil. And in it, spirit hides in matter. The body is layered in meaningful garments. There is tattoos and or techniques to stay cool and protected around us. It's kind of like that old parable, whether it's true or not, around the golden Buddha, the one that was hidden in clay from invaders. I think it was somewhere in Cambodia. And then years later, this monk started chiseling away at this and started discovering that beneath the clay and beneath like the current state of this Buddha was actually a golden Buddha. And I think that it's a beautiful test to what we are all dealing with in this space at all times, but especially when this conjunction happens. It's like, well, it takes a lot of strength to hold a shield up. It takes a lot of effort as well to protect our hearts and secure our safety and well-being from being hurt again, right? It's like we want to connect, we want to love, we want to do this, but our mind can take over, specifically where Mercury is at the moment, at 19 degrees of Virgo, and it can really ruin things. And so we see then, like when the two of them come together, maybe there is this amazing opportunity to forge some sort of an agreement and see this as a beginning, knowing how to trust them, how to wake with them, how to see them in the morning, how to pray with them, how to practice with them. And who is them but Venus and Mars? How to leave offerings to them, guns and roses, laying them all down and seeing that love and death and mystery are all found within the rose, that there's something about this life that has everything to do with connection and being able to really understand ourselves with the mirror of other. Now, when I say that, I don't mean just human other. It's also the other that is found in the natural world. It is the other that is found in our dreams. It is the other that is found in our bodies. It is other that we try to separate in this dualistic sense that, of course, is just an illusion. But we can't protect ourselves all the time. Like, there are these moments where we have to take it all off and disarm, essentially, and experience what it's like to be vulnerable, perhaps embracing the polarity of Virgo, which is Pisces. And so find it in your charts. 19 degrees of Virgo is where this conjunction happens. The Sabian symbol for that degree when you round up to 20 is an automobile caravan. Place them in the back, that is Venus and Mars in the back of the car. Cans skipping on the pavement. Maybe the Beatles playing. Just married plates on the back. And you have an image to work with here. Contemplate the cycle that has ended, right? Contemplate the one that started back in November. It was November 2nd of 2015 was the last conjunction between the two of them. It was also in the morning sky. It was also in Virgo, but it wasn't the same cycle. It was a different one. So also try not to think too hard about the one that's going to come. The next one's in 2019. Instead, be present. There is nothing that brings us there more than love. And so find it in yourself. Radiate it to all of us. Spread it to even more people. Fall into it. Rise out of it. Float away with it. Listen to the Zephyrs song. Know which story is yours and live it. Find your proper myth to teach you. We are living myths, and as in we are living them. Not like we are living myths. No. We are living them. Living myths. And so any stories around love, any stories about Mars and Venus, any of these tales that resonate with you, I highly recommend diving right in and allowing it to inform this current situation for you. And I think that when thinking about it that way, one of the most profound examples, one of the most, we'll say, transcendental examples of this is that between Shiva and Parvati. And I'm going to read, this is one of my favorite books to kind of flip through from time to time. It's called Myth Astrology by Raven Caldera. You've probably heard me reference it from time to time on the podcast. But I'm going to read from this because I think that this is such a powerful way of understanding the dynamic between Venus and Mars, but also how funny that in this chapter on Parvati, it relates to Venus and Virgo. And so he has all the planets and signs, and he relates them to different gods and goddesses in the book, basically, and then illustrates it pretty powerfully. And so he writes, in mythology of India, the consorts of Shiva take on many different forms. As Uma, like Uma Thurman, she is the maiden of innocence. As Durga, she is the virgin warrior. As Kali, she destroys and rebirths him. These faces are as much different goddesses as the same goddess. Whether or not they are facets or separate gems is irrelevant to their power. However, the face that is the most loved and called upon, the goddess, in fact, that has the only real and loving relationship with Shiva, is Parvati. She alone is called wife, not consort or warrior. She alone truly reaches out to him with love. Now here's where the Virgo-ness comes in, but also one of the great practices I feel between these two elements inside of all of us, the dance between Venus and Mars. According to the myth, Parvati fell in love with Shiva while she was up on his mountain, doing his ascetic best to ignore the entire world. She tried every trick in the book to distract him and show him her feelings, singing, talking, begging, pleading, up to and including doing some sensual naked dance in front of him as well. He ignored it all, ensconced in his quest for enlightenment. Parvati the beautiful was stymied for the first time. That which she wanted the most was unobtainable with her usual skills. This is pretty clear as a parable for what happens to Venus when she tries to function in aesthetic Virgo. Her normal open and receptive flow is dammed up. She becomes repressed and laconic, cut to pieces by the million sharp edges of this sign's discriminatory nature. The story of Parvati gives a good clue as to the only way out of this quandary. The goddess decided that she was going to win her love no matter what it took. So Parvati, the beautiful, earthly goddess of fertility, sexy Venusian dancer, went up to the top of the mountain that faced Shiva's hermitage. There, she put aside her fancy clothing, wrapped herself in a simple shroud, sat cross-legged on the bare rock and began to meditate. She sat there for a full year, meditating and seeking enlightenment, just as Shiva did, until the brilliance of her mind and spirit penetrating the universe became so clear and bright that even he could not ignore it. And Shiva, the Mahadeva, gazed upon this powerful mind and spirit that had come so far in its quest for oneness in the universe, and he was awed and fell completely in love. He begged her to marry him, and Parvati achieved that which she had longed for. That's it. We are all longing for that connection to the universe, but our fancy dances, our fancy and shiny things, how smart we are with astrology, how amazing we can read a chart, how incredible we can be with our asanas, and how clean we can get ourselves with all of our veganness and our ayahuasca experiences. It's all a part of the process, I suppose. But really what it is all we're trying to do is connect with the universe. We're trying to connect with ourselves. We're trying to connect with something that we know intuitively in the back of our minds and our hearts, that's always there. But we confuse it within all these forms. We confuse it with what we covet. We confuse it within these love affairs. And I think that is the most important thing to always keep in mind when we're talking about love. This word that we have in the English language for it. Nothing like agape. Nothing like that. That points to it, I suppose, in a more successful manner. So what then do we expect from this conjunction on the 5th but an opportunity to get the beautiful ball rolling in that direction? What is it that we need to be discerning about? Where is it happening in the chart? How do we need to edit the program? Like, what is the new commitment? What is the new contract that we are willing to bless and kiss the ring of and be like, yes, I will embark on this 2-year journey and watch it all ebb and flow. And if that is a romantic connection with another human being, God bless it, because it's a perfect time, I think, for starting new relationships. It's probably a wonderful time to get married as well, as far as electional charts are concerned. Though I don't have that much experience in telling people to get married on Venus-Mars conjunctions. I would just assume it to be so. But for me, at this point, because it's happening very close to my ascendant, in my first house, squaring my nodes, as they get closer and closer and closer together, my love for the body, my love also for this man has been growing. The education of movement, of getting back into the primal forms of the body, of not being in stale weight rooms or running on treadmills like a mouse. I've never been into that. But like this idea of movement that goes beyond the mat, that goes up into the trees, that hangs from rings, that gets down close to the grasses. I love it. And a lot of these teachings come from this Israeli Taurus man named Ido Portal. And I'm going to allow his teachings to segue into this song by Jessica Hoop and Sam Beam. They did a collaborative album together called Love Letter for Fire. And I just think it's a beautiful combo because he, singer of Iron and Wine, is the softest version of Mars. And she, the hardest, well, to pin version of Venus. I enjoy both of them very, very much. I highly recommend supporting them, getting their album, seeing them if they're playing in your town. And you're going to love this song. It's called Every Songbird Sings. I get lost. I get lost a lot. And you meet me there. And the long walk home says that you're good for me. It's a line from the song. It's a great line from the song. It's a Venus and Mars situation, and I love collaborations where there is a guy and a gal singing together. It's kind of a thing these days, but still, I haven't gotten sick of it, especially when it's two of my favorite singer-songwriters doing it. And so I hope that you enjoy it, and I also hope that you learn something in this podcast. And if you would like, Go to holstoheavens.com. You can find the ways to support this podcast that Venus and Mars talked about at the beginning. You can sign up for readings, 32% off if you use Venus and Mars up until October 5th. And there's so much more on holstoheavens.com that you can find as well. My writing, previous podcasts, etc. Long days and pleasant nights, my friends. Be well, and I will talk to you soon. Thank you again for listening to the podcast. Sorry I wasn't able to share the song. YouTube is a bit more strict than the podcast apps. So if you'd like to listen to the whole show, go over to Spotify, the podcast app, SoundCloud, or really wherever podcasts are found. This is Tree Theater. Ciao.